Affairs in public session. Item number 1, discussion with Ms. Gerry O'Sullivan on her experience in Hebron serving as part of the Ecumenical Accompaniment Programme in Palestine and Israel. And the usual couple of housekeeping matters. Thank you very much. We have a number of mobile phone notice. Anybody who has a mobile phone that's likely to go off, could you please destroy it before it goes off and have it remain silent? And in relation to apologies, we have apologies from Deputies Pat Breen, Lucinda Creighton, Timmy Dooley, Sean Power, Noel Tracy, and Senators Pascal Donohoe and John Hannafin. And as the members will know as well, we have to read a privilege notice. By virtue of 17.2.1 of the Defamation Act of 2009, you are protected by absolute privilege in respect of the evidence you are to give to this committee. If you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter, and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person or persons by entity or by in any way as to make him or her identifiable. I want to welcome Gerry O'Sullivan and Joe O'Brien. The situation in Israel and Palestine is something that the committee has engaged itself with over the past couple of years. The committee made a joint visit to the area last year. It is part of the committee's work programme because of the EU Commission's, the European Union's relationship with the Middle East and its trade arrangements with the Euromed group of countries. And the Ecumenical Accompaniment Programme in Palestine and Israel is an international organisation that's coordinated by the World Council of Churches. There are 16 countries involved, and the programme in Ireland and the UK is managed by the Quaker Peace and Social Witness in the UK. Gerry O'Sullivan lived and worked as a volunteer as part of the EAPPI programme for 3 months from the 1st of January 2010. She's based in the area of high conflict, Hebron, which is in the southern part of the West Bank. She's made some material available to members already, and that has been circulated. So, without more ado, I will call on you, Ms. O'Sullivan, to make a contribution, which usually takes about 10 minutes. There'll be a response then from the members, and you can have closing remarks, and Mr. O'Brien can contribute as you both see fit. Gerry O'Sullivan, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Deputy Durkin, and thank you to the committee for inviting me to present. As said, I was in Hebron in the West Bank for 3 months from the 1st of January. Just a few things I want to say before I get started. First is, yes, this is Joe O'Brien, and Joe was based in Bethlehem for 3 months in 2009. Joe and I have not met before. We've had email contact, but Joe has just recently been appointed the advocacy coordinator for us EAs who return from work with EAPPI. And as I'm hearing myself saying EAPPI, I need to say to you it's the Ecumenical Accompaniment Programme in Palestine and Israel. So with a long title like that, you can understand why I will call it the EAPPI. Those of us who worked as ecumenical accompaniers on this programme are referred to as EAs. A couple of other things I need to say before I start. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, 1989, defines a child as being a person under 18 years of age. I also need to say I do not come from a legal background. However, the breaking of international law in the instances from which I quote are so stark that it would not take a legally trained person to come to conclusions. You've already received this particular document from me. These are the articles I had written while based in the West Bank and Hebron. I've also prepared a supplementary document which is on your desks. This contains all the facts and the statistics that I will quote from in my presentation, which will save you taking notes. You also have 2 medical reports which I'll refer to later, and you also have a sworn affidavit from a 15-year-old called A, to which I will refer later as well. My presentation, I'm afraid, will be a little bit longer than 10 minutes, Deputy Durkin, if you have that patience.
I'm sure we can tolerate that.
Thank you. I wondered.
We have second and third parts as well, so we have other business to deal with after.
Okay, I wondered which child I could leave out, and then I thought, really, to be fair, I couldn't leave any of the children out of the presentation. So what I want to tell you about, I actually fell in love in the West Bank, which is quite surprising, I suppose, at my age, but I fell in love with the West Bank, and I fell in love with the wonderful children that I met there. I want to tell you about these children, and I want to tell you about their life under the Israeli occupation. When I met children in the morning at 7 o'clock, accompanying them on their school runs, they were quite sleepy, quite dreamy, and quite quiet. And by the collection time at 1 o'clock, they were much more lively. Everywhere we went, they came to us in the street with little outstretched hands saying, "Hello, welcome to Hebron, who are you, what's your name, where do you come from?" So they were really very, very, just wonderful, I suppose, is what I would term them as best. I want to take you from Leinster House into Hebron on a very quick journey. You've seen this map before, I'm sure. It was in Phoenix magazine quite recently. This is the fragmentation of Palestinian land since the end of the British Mandate in 1946 through to the wars that took place up until 2010, where you will see on the fourth graphic map a huge amount of fragmentation with the West Bank completely separated from Gaza. This occupation is in breach of international law. This is a photograph of the barrier wall. This is in Bethlehem, where Joe was based, and these are two of my colleagues, one from Norway and one from Scotland. This is the wall that runs between the West Bank and that occurs on the Palestinian side of what was the armistice line and called the Green Line. Just to give you a sense of it, this is a map showing the level of settlements by Jewish settlers, Israeli settlers within the West Bank. The blue parts are the settlements, and the pink parts are the rest of the land outside of that. This is against the 4th Geneva Convention. Article 49 says that an occupational power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own population into the territory that it occupies. This is a map just to show you where Hebron is. It's down in the south of the West Bank. It has a population of something between 180,000 and 220,000. It is unique in that outside of East Jerusalem, it is the only place where Jewish settlers are living right in the heart of the city. I know some of you may have been to visit Hebron. You will find 500 to 600 settlers living in this city, and they are protected by 1,500 Israeli soldiers. So there are 3 soldiers to every settler. And this particular fact is what causes great difficulties for children and for the general populace of Hebron. Now I'd like to start introducing you to some of the children that I met when I was there. I'd like you to meet Akram. Akram is 15-year-old. He's a Palestinian. On the 24th of February, he was sent to the shop by his mom, Leila, with 15 shekels to buy bread. A few minutes later, Akram has been arrested. He's 15. He's in the yellow hoodie between the soldiers. This is Leila, who, within a few minutes, because her shop is just a few minutes from this point, came rushing out because she heard he'd been arrested. She's pleading with the soldiers, explaining to them that she's just given them 15 shekels to buy bread and would they please release him. Akram was alleged to have thrown a stone at the military. During the period he left his mother's shop and the time when he was picked up by the military, which was only a few yards, he was in view of a member of the TIF organisation, and TIF is the Temporary International Presence in Hebron. And they would have said to Leila, to Akram's mum, that they saw Akram during all that period and that he did not throw a stone. This is Akram still pleading, Leila still pleading. She's told if she doesn't go away that they will arrest her instead. Leila went to Kiryat Arba police station after her son was taken away. He was handcuffed and blindfolded, which is what happens to 97% of the children who are arrested. She went to the police station and rang on the bell, and she got no answer, even though she could see people inside. In the morning I met her and she was quite distressed. She still didn't know where her son was. She was hoping maybe he had been released from wherever he had been taken and would turn up at home, but he didn't. He still hadn't turned up by 9 o'clock in the morning. So I took her through Hebron to visit various organisations to try and find out where Akram was. Eventually we did discover he had been taken to Kiryat Arba police station. I've gone off. Three days later, I accompanied Leila to Offer Military Court, where a military trial was taking place with Akram. She said he was brought into the courtroom. He was handcuffed and shackled at the feet. She tried to speak to him, but the Israeli soldiers held her back. You're not allowed to speak to your children in court. It's now been 3 days since she's seen her 13-year-old child. On the way into the court, she was strip searched and had a metal detector put inside her panties. We heard at that stage that Akram was in Offer military prison in a tent. The prisoners are kept in tents, tent to a tent, and he was with adults. During this period of having been arrested, his parents had to lodge money into the post office account to feed him, otherwise he would have had no food. At the beginning, the other Palestinian prisoners did help him. I want you to meet Mahmoud. Mahmoud is 13 years old. He lives in the same city. He lives across...
Sorry, has he been released yet?
I'm going to come to that in a moment.
Back, sorry,
yeah.
I thought you were finished up.
Just going to come back to it in a moment. Mahmoud is 13 years old. He was released at the very same time as Akram. This is Akram outside his house after his release, but I'll come to that story again in a moment. His bail was set at €400, the equivalent of €400. His mother could not afford to pay the money, so she needed to leave him behind in prison that day that I accompanied both Leila and Fatia, Mahmoud's mum. In the end, it was a friend of the International Solidarity Movement that provided the €400 for Ahmed to be released, because they refused to release him until his parents paid the fine. So Mahmoud spent over 2 weeks in prison without speaking to his family. Now I want to tell you about Akram, as you asked. Akram was imprisoned for 2 months. This is Akram in the middle of April after his release with one of his nieces. At this stage he was able to tell his story. Akram and the other boys were taken to Kiryat Arba police station. They were handcuffed and blindfolded for 6 hours. They were individually interrogated many times. The police threatened Akram. If he admitted to throwing stones, they said he would be released. If not, they would continue to beat him, which they did. They brought out a form which was an official confession, and they tried to make him sign it. Akram refused. On the night of the arrest, Akram and Mahmoud were taken to the military camp, where they spent the night handcuffed on the floor of a military jeep. On the second day, they were taken to a detention centre and kept in an outside prison cell and exposed to the same form of interrogation. On the third day, they were taken to the first hearing in Offer military prison. At this point, these 2 boys had not slept, nor had they been offered any food. They got water once because Akram pleaded for water. After the court case, Akram was taken to Remanim prison, which is in Israel. He spent the first 3 weeks in solitary confinement. He's aged 15. For 2 to 3 hours on the days that the International Red Cross came to visit the detention centre, he was allowed out, but other than that, he was in solitary confinement. He said that one high-ranking officer told him that this officer could kill any 3 prisoners that he'd choose in the detention centre and that nothing would happen. Akram finally confessed to having thrown a stone on the 22nd of April, 6 trials later. He had gone for 5 trials, and at each one of these trials he had refused to confess that he had thrown a stone, and he maintained his innocence. Akram is now home. For 4 years, he cannot leave his home without being accompanied by an adult. In the next 8 months, in the forthcoming 4 years, if he is arrested again, he can be detained in prison for 8 months without a trial, and then this detention can be extended without a trial for another 8 months. The Irish representative in Ramallah, Jim Carroll, arranged to have an observer at the 6th trial in Akram's case. Defence for Children International in Hebron say it's extremely unusual for somebody like Akram, somebody like Akram at 15 years of age, to refuse to sign a confession. Over 80% of children resign their confessions during the interrogation phase. I just want to tell you about another 2-3 children, and then I'm going to move on to some statistics. I'd like you to meet brothers Hassan, aged 12, and Amir, aged 8. They were also arrested for allegedly throwing stones. This is little Amir is aged 8 on the right, and Hassan is beside him, his brother. He's aged 12. This is Amir, aged 8, being taken to the military jeep. As you can see, he is crying. This is Hassan being taken to a military detention centre. Hassan was imprisoned in Offa military jail at the age of 12 for 2 weeks. He was not indicted, but he was kept in jail until his last trial date, which was on a Sunday. He was forced to sign a document that was written in Hebrew. He doesn't know what he signed. He doesn't speak Hebrew, or he doesn't understand the language. He was fined the equivalent of €800 in order for him to be released. Since Hassan has left jail, he has a sleeping disorder. He's been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. I have the copies of the medical reports here for you also. He has nightmares. He feels guilty. He's afraid all of the time. He has difficulty concentrating. He has changed the way he engages with his family and others. He has a tremor in his right leg, and he has socially isolated himself and dropped out of school. This is Amir, whom I also got to know quite well. Amir, on the same day, could not be arrested because he wasn't deemed to be a minor, because he's under 12. He was detained from 3:30 in the afternoon approximately to 11 o'clock that night. He says the soldiers bit him and they shouted at him. For all Amir's detention time, he was blindfolded and left sitting on a chair. He could hear the guard dog panting beside him for all of this period. He was jeered by some settlers who also live in the Beit Ramona military camp. He had no food. He had no water. He was not allowed to go to the bathroom. And he was so scared he wet himself. He spent 7.5 hours in this condition. When I met Amir on the day after his release, he was ashen-faced. I had not met him before, but even I could see he was like a piece of white paper. He was unable to speak. He's had nightmares. He's screaming in his sleep. He's lost control of his bladder. He's nervous. He's got a bad family relationship now. And with the opposite to Hassan, his brother, he avoids being alone at all times. He is very affected by the presence of dogs. Again, his diagnosis on the medical report I've given to you is post-traumatic stress disorder. I'd like to tell you something about the discriminatory laws. And you have these in the document, the supplementary document that I've given to you. There is a difference between the way Palestinians and Israelis or settler children or Israeli children are treated. And just bearing in mind that the presence of settler children and all of their families in the West Bank is contrary to international law. A Palestinian child comes under Israeli military law. An Israeli or settler child comes under Israeli civil law. And the differences afforded by this is that you're considered to be a minor if you're a Palestinian from the age of 12 to 16, and an adult when you're over 16. If you're an Israeli or a settler child, you are a minor between 16 and 18, and you're not considered to be an adult until 18. If you are a Palestinian, you can be detained for 8 days without a court appearance. If you're an Israeli or a settler, you can only be detained for 12 hours before the court appearance. If you're a Palestinian, your family is not allowed to visit you. If you're an Israeli, your family is allowed to visit you if you're a child under arrest and in detention. If you're a Palestinian, you're interrogated by the military or by the police. If you're an Israeli or a settler child, your interrogation is carried out by a child investigator who usually comes from a social work background. If you're a Palestinian, your family are not allowed to be present during interrogation. And if you're an Israeli or a settler child, the interrogation cannot take place unless your parents are present. So what happens after arrest? I want to give you a quotation from Defence for Children International. They say, once in the military jeep along with the soldiers, children are invariably subjected to cruel and humiliating treatment at the hands of their captors. They are usually made to sit on the floor of the jeep at the soldiers' feet. Often the soldiers kick and beat the detainees. They're cursed and they're threatened and subjected to a torrent of verbal abuse for the duration of the journey. The journey can last for anything from 20 minutes to 2 hours. DCI also state that this abuse and humiliation is the norm. It's systemic and it's well documented. The DCI lawyers represent between 30 and 40% of the children who are imprisoned in the West Bank. Just some statistics for you. In 2009, 97% of the children who were arrested had their hands tied. 92% were blindfolded. 81% confessed during interrogation. 69% were beaten or kicked. 65% were arrested from their homes between midnight and 4 a.m. This is when the families are asleep. 14% are in solitary confinement, and 4% experience sexual assault. DCI would also state that despite the statistics, they have a suspicion from other instances that they hear that the sexual assaults occur in more cases than 4%. I want to tell you about a little boy named A. He's aged 15. I haven't met this boy, but this report was sent to me by DCI Palestine a couple of weeks ago. He was arrested on the 26th of May. The charge, again, was throwing stones. He was taken from his home at 1:30 in the morning with his parents watching what was happening. Again, his hands were tied behind his back with plastic ties and he was blindfolded before placed downwards on the floor of a military vehicle. First, he was taken to a nearby settlement, the Israeli settlement of Karmi Zur. He was taken inside, made to sit on a chair, tied and blindfolded until around 9 a.m. the next morning. He was not allowed to go to the bathroom, despite persistently asking, until after 11 a.m. And I'm quoting from the child called A. He says, at around 10 or 10:30 a.m., I was taken to the interrogation room. The plastic ties were replaced with handcuffs. I was told to sit on the floor. I was still blindfolded. The interrogator asked me, "Don't you want to tell me who threw stones with you?" And he replied, he said, "I didn't throw any stones and I don't know who threw stones either." The interrogator said, "You're a liar," and kicked him hard on the back. The interrogator then left the room and returned 5 minutes later with what A believes were what are called car battery jump leads. In his statement, child A says, he placed one end on my handcuffs and the other end on my penis. And I felt great pain and started screaming. He said, the interrogator, "I want you to confess or otherwise I will plug in the cable and you will never have children." Initially, A refused to confess, but the interrogator kicked him in the back several times and placed his foot on the handcuffs. He then confessed to throwing stones a few weeks ago, he said, as well as 2 years ago. He said, "I confessed because I didn't want to be tortured all over again." On the 1st of June 2010, after 2 appearances in Offa Military Court and 1 appeal, A was released on bail with the equivalent of €100 and 2 guarantees of €5,000 from his father and his uncle. A has still not been charged with an offence. The ill-treatment techniques. Again, from DCI, they get, again, their information from the lawyers who work for them. Commonly, excessive use of blindfolds, handcuffs, slapping, kicking, sleep deprivation, solitary confinement, denial of food and water for extended periods of time, denial of access to toilets, denial of access to showers or changing of clothing, exposure to extreme heat and cold, position abuse, yelling and exposure to loud noises, insults and cursing, arresting family members or alleging that family members have been arrested, and occasionally sexual abuse. And you've just heard one of these examples. The common threats are being beaten or having family members, threatening to have their family members harmed, being imprisoned for an indefinite period of time or having other family members imprisoned, having work permits or study permits revoked, being sexually abused, being attacked by dogs, being subject to some sort of physical abuse, and the threat of having their family home demolished. The statistics, DCI statistics in 2008, an average of, and you have these statistics as well in the document, an average of 324 Palestinian children were detained each month in 2008. In most cases, the lawyer does not get to see the child until a few minutes before the court case. 91% of children are kept in pre-trial detention. 99.71% of children arrested are found to be guilty. 1.24% of cases have full evidentiary trial. And some more statistics. In 2008, 26.7% of the children detained were detained for the charge of stone throwing. The maximum penalty for children throwing a stone at a moving military vehicle is 20 years under Military Order 378. For a stationary vehicle, it's 10 years. There have been 600 complaints about the arrests and detention of children between 2000 and 2008. No complaint has been investigated to date. 4 out of 5 of the prisons for children are in Israel. Most parents cannot get a permit to go into Israel. So the norm is if a child is in prison for 2 months, a parent will not have got a permit to visit that child during that period. Imprisoning children from an occupied country in the country of the occupier breaches the 4th Geneva Convention, Article 46. What does international law say about the arrest of children? The United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child says the arrest and the detention of children must be used only as a last resort and for the appropriate period of time, and that the juvenile detainees must be separated from adults, allowed contact with their families, and receive appropriate assistance, including access to education, recreation and rehabilitation. Neither Akram, aged 15, Mahmoud, aged 13, Amir, aged 8, Hassan, aged 12, or the child known as A, aged 15, received any of this. The breaching of international laws in these cases. the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. This was ratified by the State of Israel in 1991. Articles 3, 37, 38 and 40 have been breached. The Fourth Geneva Convention, ratified by the State of Israel in 1951, Articles 3, 27, 31, 33, 37, 42, 66, 71, 72 and 76 have been breached. In the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ratified by the State of Israel in 1992, Articles 7, 9 and 14 have been breached. Under the UN Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane and Degrading Treatment or Punished, this was ratified by the State of Israel in 1991. Articles 1, 2, 4, 12, 13, 15 and 16 have been breached. This was my cursory look. I didn't quote an article unless it was so stark that you couldn't deny. I'm sure if lawyers were to look at these cases, they would probably find a lot more articles breached. So EAPPBI is the programme with which I worked and Joe worked in the West Bank. So what was our role? It was protection by presence, monitoring of human rights, supporting Palestinian and Israeli peace activists, and advocacy work. Part of that advocacy work is what I am doing here with you today. Who are we in EAPPI? It's the World Council of Churches, or the programme who initiated it, who initiated it, and the request had come from the heads of churches in Jerusalem in 2003. We come from 18 different countries, and the Irish and the UK EAs, like Joe and I, are supported and trained by the Quaker Peace and Social Witness in the UK. These were my colleagues in Hebron. Sophia on the left is from Sweden, and Alex on the right from Switzerland. It was with these two women that I worked and lived 24/7 during my period there. What will bring justice? An end to the occupation. Adherence to international law. Implementation of the UN resolutions. An immediate end to the building of settlements. The lifting of restrictions on movement and access. What are Palestinians asking of you? I would have asked this question many times. What message do you want me to bring back to Ireland? Atta Jaber says, what about our humanity? We want it from you internationals. We won't get it from the Israelis. Atta's house was demolished twice. Both the settlers and the military have occupied his house on one occasion each. This was his original family home. I asked him how long he lived in Baka. He said 600 years. This is the cave in which his family lived. There is a settlement currently being built at the top of the quarry above this cave. He's here showing the Irish ambassador to Israel, Breffney O'Reilly, and Jim Carroll, the Irish representative to the Palestinian Authority, where his family had lived for 600 years in the West Bank. This is Adel Karim. He asks, he says, we need those with the conscience to try and help us live and work safely because we want to live in peace and not to make war. Adel Karim is here with his wife Zebede. Their house has been demolished once. They've now built a very small house with one window and one door because they are petrified it will happen again. You'd like me to finish?
Yes, okay.
Just a message from Leila. Leila says she wants you to please do something about the children that have been arrested. I have promised these children, I promised their parents, that I will do everything I can to get the stories of the children out to you. You are the people with power and influence, and I would like to hand the stories of these children to you in Dáil Éireann.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, I will take Gay Mitchell MEP, Secretary Leyden, and been with a variety of Deputy Brendan Howard, Deputy Sean Bard, John Tuffy, Senator Mark Deary. We keep going like that, we'll see what happens. We're going to be out of here, ladies and gentlemen, in we have to move on to the next item, which is the Green Paper. It's a very important issue, and we have to spend a little bit of time talking about that and clearing things up for the autumn. So, as I started, Gay Mitchell, MEP.
Thank you, Chairman. I can thank Ms O'Sullivan for what she had to say. Clearly, the ending of the occupation is going to be part of the solution. We all know the solution has to be a two-state solution. It took us 30 years in Northern Ireland to get the Sunningdale Agreement for slow learners, as somebody put it. And all of this is really very upsetting, particularly when you listen to the detail about young children. In the European Parliament, and I'm sure in the Dáil and Senate as well, we've been given to understand that the Israeli Supreme Court is independent and acts independently as we would expect our Supreme Court in Ireland to act. What's been your experience of the Israeli Supreme Court, and have any of these cases been taken to the court? Any of the individual, you said there were 600 complaints and none of them have been investigated so far. Does the Supreme Court, for example, have competence in the area of military law, or has there been any role for the Israeli Supreme Court in this? Thank you.
We will bank the questions,
yes,
if you might, please, and we'll take them then. Next is Senator Terry Lane.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and I'd like to welcome Gerry O'Sullivan and Joe O'Brien to the meeting. And I'd like to confirm, in fact, what the evidence has been given here today, because about 4 years ago, Eamon Gilmore, now leader of the Labour Party, John Gormley, late Tony Gregory, John Paul Phelan, English Noddy and myself went to Hebron. So we actually experienced what you have witnessed there. And fortunately, we have international observers. If we hadn't international observers, the plight of the Palestinians in their own city of Hebron would be far worse, because they witnessed what's going on there. We witnessed ourselves the fact that the area surrounding the mosque has actually been deprived of the traders who had nice businesses there, and has been surrounded by the actual settlers. And quite frankly, I would call that the settlement in Hebron would be removed. It's the most obvious solution, that 500 settlers, protected by about 1,500 troops, are in an area of the old city and in the area near the mosque. And the fact is, as far as I know, part of the mosque was divided and turned into a synagogue. And in fact this caused enormous difficulty there, and we ourselves, that group, actually were practically the Israeli army went into a firing position, and we could have lost the leaders of two major parties over that particular day. It was a very serious incident, actually, on that particular day. We were accompanied by Palestinian Liberation Organisation. We were actually guests of the PLO, so we were under a certain suspicion when we went along that area surrounding the mosque and into the mosque. So I just want to say I commend you and your colleagues on the work you are doing. It's absolutely vital that we have observers there to assist the Palestinians and the Palestinian children, as you have given evidence here today. And it's very important that they're brought to a worldwide audience, and indeed the media have played a very important role in this particular regard. Now, there's in a further documentation 1054, there's a press release from the General Delegation of Palestine, and the wall is now 6 years old. And the state has stated quite clearly, as stated by the United Nations, this is illegal. The division of Palestine and the West Bank by this concrete wall, which is right around Bethlehem, as Joe would know from his experience there. But I think people that were not visiting that area can't really realise how bad the situation is, and how there would no finality to it unless we realise that, first of all, the settlers are caused enormous difficulty. And in fact, as you know, there was an atrocity carried out in the mosque by a settler who killed about 6 people, or 6 Palestinians or more. 26?
29.
Yes, 29. I mean, that's very fresh in the memories of the people in that particular area. So I just want to say I hope that you continue your work, and I hope that we will continue our work here in this committee to ensure that we do keep in touch with that region. And I must say, I also feel very comfortable that, in fact, the late Brian Nanahan was the first foreign minister of any European country to recognise the two-state solution. And he actually recognised the right of Palestinians of self-determination. It was a very courageous statement at that time. Now it's become policy. It wasn't policy when he pushed that policy out from this country. So I think Ireland has a particular, as you know yourself, has a particular strong standing in Palestine and in the occupied areas. So I just want to say that thank you for coming here today, and I'm delighted, Chairman, that you gave an opportunity to Gerry Sullivan to put forward her views and her evidence here today that it can get wider dissemination in the media. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Deputy Brendan Howland.
Just firstly to thank Mrs. Sullivan for giving us, unfortunately, what is a harrowing tale of her own experiences in the 3 months she spent in Hebron. I have just one brief question. Because the solutions you lay out are big-ticket issues that a lot of international forces are working towards, and we're not going to affect it in the deliberations of this committee this afternoon, although we need to keep them on our agenda. But the question is in relation to the very worrying aspect of a disparate law for Palestinians and Israelis. And I know Mrs. Sullivan is not a lawyer, but just to ask, on what basis under the Israeli constitution, which is a progressive modern constitution, could there be different sets of laws for different people in the same jurisdiction, and how does that sit with Israel's obligation in international law and international organisations to which Israel itself is a party? If it's possible to give us a view on that.
Thank you. Deputy Sean Barrett.
I would like to join with others in thanking Gerry O'Sullivan for sharing her experiences here this afternoon. I think her contribution from my point of view is based on the rights of children. And what astonishes me is the fact that Israel ratified that convention on the rights of the child back in October of 1991. And whilst we won't solve the Israeli-Palestine problem here this afternoon, as Deputy MEP Gay Mitchell said, it's an ongoing process which we all subscribe to. But I would suggest here, Chairman, if you are agreeable, we formally should, as a committee, take up this blatant breach of human rights in relation to children as a committee of this Parliament, of the Joint Oireachtas, because that to me is the most blatant, serious issue that has come to light here today. We don't have, I accept totally what Gerry has to say in relation to her own personal experience and other stories told to her, and I've no reason to disbelieve any of it, but there are courts to decide all these things, but where there's a blatant breach of a UN convention by a government that has a signature to that convention, I believe that we as a committee should formally take this matter up and inquire as to why this breach has not been pursued. So that would be my contribution today, and to thank Gerry for bringing this matter to our attention. As a committee and other committees in this House, we will continue the process of doing our tuppence worth trying to resolve the overall problem. But when it comes to the rights of the child, whether you're 8, 12 or 16 or 15, these horrific stories should be investigated and those responsible should be brought to justice, and that's what I would like to see coming out of today's meeting. And if this committee can in any way progress that matter, I think we should do it formally as a committee, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Mark Deary.
Thanks, Joan, and thank you very much, Gerry, for what really is a very disturbing series of stories that you told of child abuse, state child abuse. Very upsetting to hear it. I would support Deputy Barrett that this committee ought to take up these cases and others in a formal sense. I have a great belief that third parties in regard to conventions have responsibility for others who have also signed the convention. Obviously not direct responsibility, but there is that principle in law of third party responsibility, and perhaps that is a tack we could take in regard to addressing these issues under the conventions that you've identified have been, the articles within conventions that we are co-signatories with Israel to, that you've identified have been broken, and as you say yourself, there may well be others. Just finally to note, Chairman, that Amnesty International in its annual audit on human rights has identified as the default mode, behavioural mode of Israeli military and settlers to be one of impunity. That is how they behave. That is their default mode of behaviour. I read that a couple of weeks ago in the context of how Irish citizens were treated in regard to the Rachel Corrie and all of that. But the stories you tell today completely underscore the truth of Amnesty's assertion.
Thank you. Deputy Joanna Tuffy.
Thanks, Chair. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Ms O'Sullivan for her presentation. I'm just back from Castle Gregory myself, so I just very much enjoyed my time there. Just noted that you're from there. There's just one issue I wanted to raise with your own presentation, and that is that when you had the bit where you said, what can be done to bring about justice, and I just feel it was a bit, in terms of the list, it was a bit one-sided because, as Deputy Gay Mitchell pointed out there is a conflict here, and there's a need for a peace process, and there's a need for, lots of other things that to do with the hardship that has been suffered over the period of this conflict by the Israelis as well. And I think, in terms of what we present here, we need to always keep that in mind. And I just wanted to ask two questions. One was, have you raised the issues that you've raised in this with any of the authorities in Israel, and how have they responded to those representations? And secondly, have you been talking to any of the other groups on the ground that would work specifically in relation to children's rights, such as the United Nations and so on, UNICEF, just in terms of how they progress these issues? Are you aware of anything there? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Senator Fergal Quinn.
Thank you indeed, Mr Sullivan. That's been most interesting and horrific to hear that. I'd never heard of the Ecumenical Accompaniment Programme before, first time, so today is an opportunity for education for us. Do you only work in Palestine and Israel? And is there a reason why you singled out Palestine and Israel rather than some of the other parts of the world as well? And is yours a worldwide enterprise? Israel is a democracy, so it means that we at least have some chance of being able to carry the normal force of law through Israel, whereas that isn't possible in many other parts of the world. And if you don't operate elsewhere, is that one of the reasons why? I'm just horrified to think that goes what the stories you've told us, but I imagine it goes on in other parts of the world as well, and I'd like to think that there's, if not your organisation, some organisation that's able to shed light on that as well.
Thank you very much. I should mention as well that during the course of the joint visit with the Foreign Affairs Committee to that region last year, it was we were addressed by NGOs and we had a number of discussions with them. It became quite obvious that there are blatant human rights abuses, in fact on all sides in that region. And the point still remains, and has been made by the members, that there is no excuse whatsoever for the blatant abuses that have taken place and obviously continue to take place. And this committee has taken up this in the past, and in line with what the suggestions made by Deputy Barrett and others, the committee will be quite happy. In the course of the sittings that we are currently engaged in, which we are devoting some considerable time to that region, and we hope in the course of it to be able to deal to a greater extent with the abuses of children or adults, whether prisoners or otherwise, because no prisoner charged with whatever crime should be abused while in custody, because the abuser is the institution of the state in that case, and that in turn brings ridicule on all institutions associated. So I think that the points you have made are well made, and while we're not going to be able to have time to go through in any great deal of detail today the arising issues, we will take up those issues as you set them out. So over to you for final response, closing remarks.
Thank you.
We do have to be out in the next 5 minutes because the next part of our programme is going to be a serious issue as well. Back over to yourself.
Okay, within just a couple of minutes left to me then, just very, very briefly, the questions are on the Supreme Court. No, I'm not qualified to say that, but I wonder, is there an issue between the children who are Palestinian coming under military law as opposed to civil law, and whether that's a factor? Fadel Mutasab, the father of Hassan and Amir, asked me to find out what could be done, so I sent the case to Amnesty. But in a long runaway around everywhere in the world, the final suggestion was to bring it back to Defence for Children at International Palestine in Ramallah. So they are hopefully working on taking a case there. Deputy Laden, yes, 1994 was the Barak Goldstein massacre and the Israeli military response after the Jewish settler had killed 29 Palestinians was to clear the main street, Shahada Street, of 1,800 shops, offices and homes. And this is the place where the 500 to 600 settlers are now living under protection. Deputy Howland, again, that was the Supreme Court question. Deputy Barrett, thank you, and also Deputy Deary for offering to take up this case. I don't think it's a case that can wait till the occupation ends. I think it's a case that needs to be acted on immediately. According to the statistics from March 2010, 30 children were arrested, and that means that on average there is a chance, a very high chance, that one more child will be arrested in Hebron between now and this time tomorrow. It cannot wait. The Israeli response to this, to Deputy Tuffy, you had said it was one-sided. The Israeli response is that this needs to be done to prevent children becoming terrorists. Any time I did try to talk, I didn't have time to do the UN and do all that out, and I've been really busy since I came back. But any time I did try to challenge soldiers, I was told not to ask questions, or the other police and soldiers in the area were told not to respond to my questions. One soldier I did have a conversation with, and that we in EAPPI and two people from the Christian Peacemakers team actually succeeded in having 2 children released. But this soldier wasn't believing the stories I was telling him, and I think it was probably the shock that enabled him to release. Deputy Quinn, you were asked about EAPPI. Currently they're only in Palestine and Israel. You asked why only this country. It was the Christian churches in Jerusalem who saw that there was a need for some element of an impartial observation. I won't call us a force, but a group of people to be in there. Currently they are looking into having a presence in Colombia. Okay, and they've been in the West Bank, Joe, since 2003 or 4?
2003.
2003. Yes, have I answered all your questions?
Yeah.
Joe?
Yes, Joe.
Again, on the Supreme Court issue, I'm not a lawyer either. In practice, there's 2 parallel legal systems. There's attempts to get them to overlap there, but they tend not to be very successful to get them to overlap. Welcome Deputy Barrett's suggestion as well. What I would say overall in relation to Gerry's presentation, these aren't isolated incidents. It's absolutely regular policy that this happens. I spoke to children myself when I was there last year and took a number of accounts as well. It's standard practice. What I would say as well is that there are other Irish observers going out at the end of this year, and they would be very happy to feed their testimonies that they take into this committee as well. In relation to what we do on the ground when we hear these reports, we don't necessarily directly ourselves lobby the authorities there. Our reports are fed into the UN and the Red Cross, and we let them take it from there in that location, but we obviously bring it here as well. I'll leave it at that. I know you're pressed for time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Well, we will certainly take your advice, and we will follow up in the course of the hearings that we have already undertaken in relation to issues in that region and associated therewith. So we will. These meetings will become part of a report which will be produced by the committee at a later stage, and we may at some stage in the future have recourse to you again for further discussions. So I want to thank you both very much for coming before us today, for going to the trouble of preparing your report, and I know that it will be of tremendous use to the committee. That is item number 1. We now must go into private session for the next part, so I will suspend for 60 seconds while we change the guard.